The morning sun cast long shadows across the Oklahoma plains as Samuel Redfeather stepped onto his weathered front porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his calloused hands. The silence stretched endlessly before him, broken only by the gentle lowing of cattle in the distance and the whisper of wind through the tall grass. This was his sanctuary, his piece of earth where 3 generations of his family had worked the land, raised livestock, and lived in harmony with the rhythm of the seasons. Samuel was a man of few words, but deep convictions. His weathered face told the story of countless days under the unforgiving sun, and his dark eyes held the wisdom passed down through Cherokee bloodlines that ran as deep as the roots of the ancient oak tree shading his modest farmhouse. At 58, he had seen enough of life to know that peace was precious and hard-won, but he had also learned that some things were worth fighting for. The ranch had been his family since his great-grandfather had purchased the land with money earned from working the cattle drives of the late 1800s. Back then, being Cherokee and owning land was no small feat, and the stories of struggle and perseverance had been passed down like sacred teachings from father to son. Samuel's grandfather had carved the traditional Cherokee symbol into the wooden door of the farmhouse, 7 pointed stars arranged in a circle, representing the 7 clans of the Cherokee Nation. It was more than decoration. It was a declaration of identity, heritage, and belonging. The ranch itself was modest but well-maintained. Rolling hills covered in native grass provided perfect grazing for Samuel's small herd of cattle, and a clear stream meandered through the property, ensuring water year-round. The farmhouse was simple but sturdy, built from local timber and stone, designed to withstand the harsh Oklahoma weather. Samuel had modernized it over the years, but he had been careful to preserve the original character and the symbols that connected him to his ancestors. Samuel lived alone now. His wife, Maria, had passed away 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, and their only son, David, worked as a teacher on the Cherokee Reservation 2 counties over. David visited when he could, but he had his own family to care for, and Samuel understood the demands of modern life. Still, there were times when the silence felt heavy, when the memories seemed to echo louder than the wind. On this particular morning, something felt different. Samuel couldn't put his finger on it, but his instincts, honed by years of reading the land and the weather, told him to pay attention. The cattle seemed restless, moving in tight groups rather than spreading out to graze as they normally would. Even his old blue heeler, Chief, seemed on edge, his ears perked and alert as he scanned the horizon. Samuel set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch, shading his eyes against the morning sun as he surveyed his property. Everything looked normal. The fences were intact, the gates were closed, and there was no sign of predators or disturbance. But the feeling persisted, a prickle at the back of his neck that his grandmother used to call spirit whispers, the way the world tried to warn you when trouble was coming. He spent the morning doing his usual chores, feeding the cattle, checking the water troughs, and inspecting the fencing along the eastern boundary. It was during this routine patrol that he first noticed the tire tracks. They were fresh, probably from the night before, and they didn't belong to any of the vehicles that normally came onto his property. The tracks led from the county road to a small rise about a quarter mile from his house, a spot that provided a clear view of his entire operation. Samuel knelt beside the tracks, studying them with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read signs in the earth. There had been at least 2 vehicles, one with worn tires that left a distinctive tread pattern, and another with newer tires that suggested a larger vehicle, possibly a truck. They had stopped at the rise for some time. He could see where boots had walked around, cigarette but scattered in the grass, and the impression where someone had set up what looked like binoculars or a scope. A cold understanding settled in Samuel's chest. Someone had been watching him, studying his routine, learning the layout of his property. This wasn't the work of curious neighbors or lost travelers. This was surveillance, and in his experience, people only conducted surveillance when they were planning something. Samuel had heard the stories from other ranchers in the area. Small operations like his were increasingly targeted by organized groups who saw isolated properties as easy marks. They would case a place for days or weeks, learning when the owner was most vulnerable, then strike fast and hard. Sometimes they took livestock, sometimes equipment, and sometimes they took everything, leaving families devastated and struggling to rebuild their lives. The thought of someone violating his land, his family's legacy, filled Samuel with a quiet rage. This wasn't just property to him. It was sacred ground, blessed by the sweat and sacrifice of his ancestors, sanctified by the tears his family had shed when his grandmother passed away in the bedroom overlooking the eastern pasture, made holy by the laughter of his son playing in the yard and the gentle presence of his late wife tending her garden. He returned to the house and retrieved his rifle from the gun cabinet, checking to make sure it was clean and loaded. Samuel wasn't a violent man by nature, but he had served in the army in his younger days, and he understood that sometimes strength was the only language that bullies understood. He also called his neighbor, Tom Harrison, whose ranch bordered his to the south. Tom had been ranching in the area for almost as long as Samuel's family, and the two men had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared challenges. When Samuel described what he had found, Tom's voice grew serious. "I've been hearing rumors," Tom said. "There's a group that's been hitting ranches about 50 miles west of here. They call themselves the Barton Boys, led by a man named Jake Barton. Word is they're moving east, looking for softer targets. You need to be careful, Sam." Samuel thanked Tom for the information and promised to stay in touch. After hanging up, he spent the rest of the day making preparations. He moved his most valuable equipment into the barn and secured it with additional locks. He checked all the lights around his property to make sure they were working, and he made sure his cell phone was fully charged and within easy reach. As evening approached, Samuel sat on his porch with Chief beside him, watching the shadows lengthen across his land. The Cherokee symbol on his door caught the last rays of sunlight, and he thought about what it represented. Not just his heritage, but his responsibility to protect what had been entrusted to him. His great-grandfather had taught him that a man's character wasn't measured by what he did when life was easy, but by how he responded when faced with challenges that tested his very soul. The old stories spoke of warriors who stood alone against overwhelming odds, not because they were fearless, but because they understood that some things were worth any sacrifice. Samuel didn't know what the coming days would bring, but he knew he wouldn't back down. This land had shaped him, and he would defend it with everything he had. The Cherokee mark on his door wasn't just a symbol of where he came from. It was a promise of who he was and what he would do to protect what mattered most. As night fell and the stars began to emerge in the vast Oklahoma sky, Samuel felt the presence of his ancestors around him. They had faced their own challenges, their own threats to everything they held dear, and they had endured. Their strength flowed through his veins. Their wisdom guided his thoughts, and their courage would sustain him in whatever trial lay ahead. The wind picked up, rustling through the grass with a sound like whispered prayers, and Samuel knew that he was not truly alone. Whatever came next, he would face it as a Cherokee warrior, as the guardian of his family's legacy, and as a man who understood that sometimes the greatest victories came from the willingness to stand firm when everything seemed lost. The next morning brought an unnatural stillness to the ranch, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Samuel had slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of Chief's low growls and the restless movement of his cattle. Each time he had risen to check the windows, scanning the darkness for any sign of intruders, but the night had passed without incident. As dawn broke, Samuel followed his usual routine, but with heightened awareness. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the barn door, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of grass in the morning breeze. He moved through his chores with the measured pace of someone who knew that appearing vulnerable might invite attack, but who also refused to be driven into hiding on his own land. It was while he was feeding the cattle in the north pasture that he first saw them. 3 vehicles moving slowly along the county road, slowing down as they passed his gate. Samuel continued his work, but he watched them from the corner of his eye, noting details that might prove important later. The lead vehicle was a black pickup truck with tinted windows and a damaged front bumper. Behind it came a white SUV with mud-caked license plates, and bringing up the rear was an old sedan with primer spots along the doors. The vehicles didn't stop, but they drove past twice, and Samuel could feel the weight of eyes studying him from behind those darkened windows. After they disappeared over the hill, he made his way back to the house and called Tom Harrison. "They're here," Samuel said simply when Tom answered. "How many?" Tom's voice was tense. 3 vehicles, maybe 8 or 9 men total. "They're scouting, trying to figure out the best approach." "I'm calling the sheriff," Tom said. "Deputy Martinez is good people. and she knows the situation with these Barton boys. Samuel appreciated the gesture, but he also knew the reality of rural law enforcement. Deputy Martinez was indeed a good officer, but she covered a territory that spanned hundreds of square miles, and response times could be measured in hours rather than minutes. If trouble came, Samuel would be on his own for the critical first moments. After Tom hung up, Samuel spent time thinking about defensive positions around his property. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise, which gave him good visibility in all directions, but it also made him visible to anyone approaching. The barn offered good cover and multiple exit routes, but it was too far from the house to reach quickly if he was caught by surprise. The Cherokee in him thought about the old ways, the tactics his ancestors had used when facing superior numbers. They had survived by being smart, by using the land to their advantage, and by choosing their battles carefully. They understood that sometimes the best defense was not to be where your enemies expected you to be. Samuel decided to prepare multiple positions around his property, places where he could take cover and hold his ground if necessary. He moved supplies, water, ammunition, a first aid kit, and emergency food to the barn, the old root cellar behind the house, and a spot in the rocky outcropping near the stream where his grandfather had once built a hunting blind. As he worked, memories flooded back of the stories his grandfather had told him about the old days when Cherokee families had to be ready to defend their homes against raiders and outlaws. His grandfather had been a young man during the Great Depression, when desperation drove some people to take what didn't belong to them, and he had learned that survival often depended on preparation and the willingness to stand firm. A Cherokee warrior doesn't look for trouble, his grandfather used to say, but he doesn't run from it either. The spirits of our ancestors watch over those who honor their memory by protecting what they built. The afternoon passed quietly, but Samuel remained vigilant. He noticed that his cattle had moved to the far end of the pasture, instinctively putting distance between themselves and the road. Animals often sensed danger before humans did, and their behavior confirmed what Samuel already knew. Trouble was coming. As evening approached, Samuel made final preparations. He brought Chief inside the house, knowing that the dog's acute hearing would provide early warning of any approach. He checked his rifle one more time and made sure his cell phone was charged and ready. He also took a moment to stand before the Cherokee symbol on his door, placing his hand on the carved wood and saying a prayer in the old language, asking his ancestors for strength and wisdom. The prayer connected him to something larger than himself, to a lineage of people who had faced impossible odds and found a way to survive. His great-great-grandfather had walked the Trail of Tears as a young boy, had seen his world turned upside down, and had still found the strength to build a new life in Oklahoma. His great-grandfather had fought discrimination and poverty to establish this ranch, creating something lasting from nothing but determination and hope. Samuel was the inheritor of that legacy, the current guardian of dreams and sacrifices that stretch back through generations. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar cloak, not a burden, but a source of strength. He would not be the one to let that legacy die. As darkness fell, Samuel positioned himself in the living room where he could see the front yard and the approach to his house. Chief lay beside him, ears alert, occasionally raising his head to listen to sounds that human ears couldn't detect. The house was dark except for the faint glow of a single lamp in the back bedroom, a deception designed to make it appear that Samuel had gone to bed early. Time moved slowly, marked by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the soft whisper of wind around the house. Samuel let his mind drift to memories of happier times. Maria singing in the kitchen while she cooked Sunday dinner. David as a boy learning to ride his first horse. Summer evenings spent on the porch watching storms build on the horizon. Those memories weren't just nostalgia. They were fuel for what he might have to do. Every happy moment, every peaceful evening, every family gathering had been made possible by the security of this place. The men who were coming to take that away weren't just threatening property. They were threatening the foundation of everything Samuel held sacred. At 10:37, Chief suddenly raised his head, his ears pricked forward and a low growl rumbling in his chest. Samuel immediately became alert, straining to hear whatever had caught the dog's attention. At first there was nothing, just the normal sounds of a ranch at night, but then he heard it, the distant sound of engines, moving slowly and without headlights. Samuel moved to the window and carefully peered through the curtains. In the moonlight, he could make out the dark shapes of vehicles moving along the tree line that bordered his property. They were approaching from the east, probably planning to cut his fence and access his land away from the main road, where they might be seen by passing traffic. The sight of those vehicles filled Samuel with a cold anger that burned in his chest like bent coals. These men thought they could take what they wanted from an old Cherokee rancher, thought that his isolation made him helpless. They were about to learn that isolation could be a weapon in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. Samuel checked his rifle and moved to the back door, keeping low and staying in the shadows. Chief started to follow, but Samuel commanded him to stay, knowing that the dog's safety was more important than having backup. Whatever happened next, it would be between Samuel and the men who had come to violate his land. He slipped out of the house and made his way toward the old oak tree, where he had prepared one of his defensive positions. From there, he would have clear lines of sight in multiple directions and good cover if things went bad. As he moved through the familiar darkness of his property, Samuel felt the presence of his ancestors around him, their strength flowing through him like the current of the stream that had watered this land for generations. The vehicles had stopped near the eastern fence line, and Samuel could hear the low murmur of voices as the men prepared for their assault. They thought they held all the advantages, superior numbers, the element of surprise, and the assumption that their target was an elderly man living alone. They had no idea that they were about to face not just Samuel Redfeather, but the accumulated courage and determination of all the Cherokee warriors who had come before him. As he settled into position behind the oak tree, Samuel whispered one more prayer to his ancestors, asking not for victory, but for the strength to honor their memory and protect what they had built. The carved Cherokee symbol on his distant door seemed to glow in the moonlight, a beacon of identity and purpose that would guide him through whatever trial lay ahead. The sound of wire cutters biting through fence posts carried clearly in the still night air. Samuel counted at least 6 distinct voices, their whispered conversations revealing their plan to approach the house from multiple directions while leaving one man with the vehicles as a lookout. These weren't desperate amateurs. They moved with the coordination of people who had done this before. Samuel controlled his breathing and tried to identify the men as they spread out across his property. The leader seemed to be a tall, heavily built man who gestured frequently as he gave orders to the others. Even in the dim moonlight, Samuel could see that several of them carried weapons, and their confident movements suggested they expected little resistance from their target. What they didn't know was that Samuel had spent every day of his life learning to read this land. He knew where the ground was soft enough to muffle footsteps and where it would crunch under unwary boots. He knew which paths would keep a man hidden in shadows and which would expose him to anyone watching from the right position. Most importantly, he knew every rock, tree, and fence post that could provide cover or concealment. The first 2 men approached the house directly, planning to check if Samuel was asleep before signaling the others to move in. They crept across the open ground between the fence line and the front porch, clearly visible against the pale grass. Samuel watched them through the rifle scope, tracking their movement and waiting for the right moment. When they reached the porch steps, one of the men whispered something to his companion and pointed toward the Cherokee symbol carved into the door. Even from his position behind the oak tree, Samuel could see them hesitate, studying the marking as if trying to understand what it meant. One of them pulled out a cell phone and used its light to get a better look at the carving. Samuel heard fragments of their whispered conversation carried on the night breeze, some kind of Indian symbol, and Jake said the old man lived alone. The uncertainty in their voices gave Samuel a moment of grim satisfaction. They had researched his property and his habits, but they hadn't bothered to learn about the man they were planning to rob. The Cherokee mark on his door was doing exactly what his grandfather had intended when he carved it, serving as both a declaration of identity and a warning to those who would threaten what his family had built. The 7-pointed stars arranged in a circle told the story of a people who had survived everything history could throw at them, who had been driven from their ancestral lands, but had found the strength to build new lives and new homes. While the 2 men debated what to do about the door, Samuel used their distraction to change positions. He moved silently through the shadows, using terrain features he had known since childhood to stay invisible while getting closer to the intruders. His military training kicked in, muscle memory, guiding him through movements he hadn't practiced in decades, but had never really forgotten. The leader of the group, the big man Samuel had identified earlier, was growing impatient with his scout's hesitation. Samuel heard him hiss from somewhere near the barn, "Forget the door and get inside. We're burning moonlight." One of the men on the porch tried the door handle and found it locked. He gestured toward the window, and his companion nodded. They were preparing to break in when Samuel decided it was time to announce his presence. "You gentlemen seem to be lost," Samuel called out from the darkness, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone completely comfortable with the situation. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both men on the porch spun toward the sound of his voice, one of them fumbling for what looked like a pistol tucked into his waistband. The other intruders, scattered around the property, froze in place as they tried to locate Samuel's position. "Easy now," Samuel continued, knowing that his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere in the darkness. "Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. You can turn around, walk back to your vehicles, and drive away. No harm, no foul." The leader's voice boomed across the property. "Old man, you're outnumbered 6-1. Come out where we can see you, and maybe we'll let you live long enough to watch us take everything you own." Samuel almost smiled at the man's arrogance. Jake Barton, for Samuel was now certain this was the leader of the notorious gang, clearly believed that superior numbers guaranteed victory. He had no understanding of the advantages that came with fighting on your own ground against invaders who didn't belong. 6-1 sounds about fair, Samuel replied, his voice carrying a hint of Cherokee humor that his grandfather would have appreciated. "My ancestors faced worse odds than that, and still managed to make their point." The truth was that Samuel felt anything but confident. He was indeed outnumbered, and while he had advantages of terrain and knowledge, these men had come prepared for violence. His best hope was to convince them that he wasn't the easy target they had expected, that the cost of taking his property might be higher than they were willing to pay. Jake Barton's response confirmed what Samuel already knew about the man's character. "Burn the house. If the old Indian wants to play cowboy, we'll smoke him out." The casual cruelty in Barton's voice, the way he referred to Samuel as the old Indian rather than using his name, revealed the kind of man he was dealing with. This wasn't just about robbery. It was about the fundamental belief that some people's lives and property mattered less than others. Samuel felt the familiar weight of historical injustice settling on his shoulders. His people had faced men like Barton before, men who took what they wanted and justified it with racial hatred and assumed superiority. The difference was that this time, Samuel wasn't helpless. This time, he had advantages that his ancestors could only have dreamed of. One of Barton's men produced what looked like a gasoline can from near the vehicles and started moving toward the house. Samuel knew he had to act before they could implement their plan. Once the house was burning, his tactical advantages would disappear, and he would be forced into the open where superior numbers would tell. Samuel aimed carefully and fired a single shot that sparked off the metal gasoline can, causing the man carrying it to drop it and dive for cover. The shot echoed across the property like thunder, and Samuel was already moving before the sound faded, using the confusion to relocate to his secondary position near the stream. "Next shot won't miss," Samuel called out. "I was aiming for the can, but I might not be so generous with the next target." The truth was that Samuel had been aiming for center mass on the man carrying the gasoline, but his shot had pulled slightly to the right, hitting the can instead. It was pure luck that had saved the intruder's life, but Samuel saw no reason to share that information. Jake Barton's voice carried new respect and anger. "Somebody find that old bastard and put him down. He just made this personal." Samuel heard the men spreading out, moving with more caution now that they knew he was armed and willing to use his weapon. The element of surprise was gone, but he had gained something equally valuable: the psychological advantage that came from proving he wasn't helpless. From his position near the stream, Samuel could see most of his property spread out before him. The intruders were visible as moving shadows against the lighter background of grass and sky, but he remained invisible in the deep shadows cast by the rocky outcropping where his grandfather's old hunting blind provided perfect concealment. One of the men was moving along the fence line, trying to flank Samuel's last known position. Another was approaching the barn, probably hoping to provide covering fire for his companions. The man with the gasoline can was huddled behind one of the vehicles, apparently reconsidering his career choices. Samuel tracked the movement of each intruder, noting their patterns and predicting their next moves. His military training had taught him patience, the importance of waiting for the right moment when decisive action could change the entire dynamic of a confrontation. That moment came when two of the men converged near the oak tree where Samuel had first taken position. They moved carelessly, confident that their quarry had fled to some other location. Samuel had a clear shot at both men from his current position, but taking it would reveal his location and invite return fire from multiple directions. Instead, Samuel chose a different approach, one that would have made his Cherokee grandfather proud. He picked up a fist-sized stone and hurled it with all his strength toward the barn, where it clanged against a piece of metal equipment. The sound immediately drew the attention of all the intruders, causing them to turn away from Samuel's actual position and focus on the barn. In the confusion that followed, Samuel was able to move again, this time circling behind the men near the oak tree. He closed to within 20 feet before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Gentlemen, I believe you're trespassing." Both men spun around, and in the moonlight Samuel could see the fear in their eyes as they realized how completely they had lost track of their target. One of them started to bring up his weapon, but Samuel's rifle was already aimed center mass. "I wouldn't," Samuel said quietly. "Drop your weapons and lie face down on the ground. Do it now." The authority in his voice, combined with the reality of staring down the barrel of a hunting rifle in the hands of someone who clearly knew how to use it, convinced both men to comply. They dropped their weapons and stretched out on the grass, hands visible and movement slow. "Jake," one of them called out, "we got problems over here." Samuel could hear Barton cursing in the distance, followed by the sound of hurried consultation among the remaining gang members. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't going according to plan, that the isolated rancher they had targeted was proving to be far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The Cherokee symbol on Samuel's door seemed to gleam in the moonlight, a reminder of the heritage that had given him the strength and wisdom to turn the tables on men who thought they could take what belonged to his family. The spirits of his ancestors were watching, and Samuel was determined not to disappoint them. The standoff that followed felt like it lasted hours, though Samuel knew it had been only minutes. He kept the two captured gang members under the rifle while listening to Jake Barton's increasingly frantic attempts to regain control of the situation. The gang leader's voice carried across the property as he tried to coordinate his remaining men, but Samuel could hear the uncertainty creeping in. "Tommy, you and Rick circle around from the south," Barton commanded. "We'll pin him down and finish this." But Samuel could tell that the confidence had gone out of Barton's voice. What had started as a simple robbery of an isolated rancher had turned into something else entirely. Two of his men were captured, pinned down by someone who seemed to know exactly what he was doing, and the element of surprise was completely gone. From his position behind the oak tree, Samuel could see the remaining gang members moving with far more caution now. They no longer bunched together or moved in the open. Instead, they crept from shadow to shadow, clearly nervous about what other surprises their target might have in store. Samuel used this hesitation to his advantage. Speaking loud enough for all of them to hear, he said, "Mr. Barton, I know who you are and what you've been doing to other ranchers. The sheriff has been notified, and deputies are on their way. You've got maybe 15 minutes before this place is surrounded." It was a bluff. Samuel had no idea if Tom Harrison had managed to reach Deputy Martinez or when help might arrive, but it was a calculated risk designed to pressure Barton into making a mistake. Men like Barton were used to controlling situations through fear and violence, but they often fell apart when faced with the prospect of facing organized law enforcement. "You're lying, old man," Barton called back, but Samuel detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. If the law was coming, they'd be here by now. Samuel smiled in the darkness. Barton's response told him that the gang leader was indeed worried about law enforcement, which meant he had enough experience to know that getting caught by the authorities would mean serious prison time for the entire gang. "Maybe so," Samuel replied conversationally. "But are you willing to bet your freedom on it? Because I'm perfectly comfortable waiting here all night. This is my land, my home. I've got nowhere else to be." The psychological pressure was beginning to tell on Barton's men. Samuel could hear them whispering among themselves, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch fragments. "Not worth it," and "should have stayed in Texas." One of them mentioned that this wasn't what they had signed up for, that robbing an old rancher was supposed to be easy money. Samuel realized he was witnessing the dissolution of the gang's unit cohesion. These men had followed Barton because they believed he could lead them to easy scores with minimal risk. Now, they were facing the reality that their leader had led them into a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. The two men on the ground beneath Samuel's rifle were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, whispered, "Mister, please. I got kids at home. I never wanted to hurt nobody." Samuel looked down at the young man and felt a familiar sadness. How many times throughout history had desperate people made desperate choices, only to find themselves trapped in situations that destroyed their lives and the lives of those they loved? This young man might have children waiting at home, but he had chosen to follow Jake Barton down a path that could only lead to prison or worse. "What's your name, son?" Samuel asked quietly. "Danny. Danny Martinez," the young man replied, and Samuel caught the irony of sharing a last name with a deputy who might or might not be coming to help. "Well, Danny Martinez, you've made some poor choices tonight, but it's not too late to make a better one. When this is over, you might want to think about finding a different line of work." Danny nodded eagerly, clearly hoping that cooperation might earn him some mercy when the authorities arrived. His companion, an older man with prison tattoos visible on his arms, remained silent and sullen, but Samuel could see that he too was beginning to understand the reality of their situation. Jake Barton's voice cut through the night air again, but this time it was directed at his own men rather than at Samuel. "What the hell is wrong with you people? It's one old man with one gun. Rush him from different directions, and this is over." But Samuel could hear the responses from the remaining gang members, and they were not what Barton wanted to hear. His men were questioning his judgment, pointing out that they had already lost the advantage of surprise and that the one old man had proven to be far more capable than intelligence had suggested. Samuel decided it was time to turn up the psychological pressure. Speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, he said, "Mr. Barton, take a look at the symbol carved into my front door. Do you know what it means?" There was a long pause before Barton replied, "Some Indian nonsense." "What's your point, old man?" "That symbol represents 7 generations of Cherokee warriors who never backed down from a fight, no matter what the odds. My great-great-grandfather survived the Trail of Tears. My great-grandfather fought off claim jumpers and racist vigilantes to keep this land. My grandfather defended this property during the Great Depression when desperate men tried to take what belonged to his family." Samuel's voice carried across the property with the authority of absolute conviction. Every one of them faced men who thought being Cherokee made them easy targets. Every one of them proved those men wrong. Tonight, you get to find out if that tradition is still alive. The silence that followed Samuel's words was profound. Even Jake Barton seemed to be absorbing the implications of what he had just heard. These men had come expecting to rob an isolated elderly rancher, but they had stumbled into something much larger, a confrontation with living history, with the accumulated courage of generations of people who had refused to be victims. Samuel could hear movement among the gang members, but it wasn't the coordinated advance that Barton had ordered. Instead, it sounded like people repositioning defensively, preparing to withdraw rather than attack. The entire dynamic of the confrontation had shifted, and Samuel could feel the momentum moving in his direction. It was at that moment that the distant sound of sirens began to echo across the Oklahoma plains. Samuel felt a surge of gratitude toward Tom Harrison, who had apparently managed to convince Deputy Martinez to respond quickly to the emergency call. The cavalry was indeed coming, just as Samuel had bluffed. Jake Barton's reaction was immediate and profane. Samuel heard him screaming at his men to grab the weapons and get back to the vehicles, abandoning any pretense of continuing the assault on the ranch. But his men were already moving, and from the sound of it, they weren't waiting for orders. "Danny," Samuel said to the young man lying on the ground, "if you're smart, you'll stay right where you are. Running will just make things worse." Danny nodded eagerly, clearly having no intention of trying to escape. His companion looked like he was considering making a break for it, but the sound of approaching sirens and Samuel's rifle convinced him that staying put was the wiser choice. The gang members who were still mobile had reached their vehicles and were preparing to flee. Samuel could hear engines starting and doors slamming as they prepared to abandon their captured comrades. But Even as they prepared to escape, Samuel could hear Jake Barton's voice raised in fury, promising vengeance against the Cherokee rancher who had humiliated him and destroyed his gang. "This isn't over, old man," Barton screamed into the night. "I know where you live, and I'll be back." Samuel almost smiled at the empty threat. Jake Barton was about to become the focus of a massive manhunt, and he would have far more important things to worry about than seeking revenge against one rancher. Besides, Samuel was no longer the isolated target that Barton thought he had been stalking. The Cherokee rancher had allies now, law enforcement, neighbors, and the support of a community that had been threatened by Barton's gang. As the sound of fleeing vehicles faded into the distance, and the police sirens grew closer, Samuel allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had successfully defended his land, protected his family's legacy, and honored the memory of his ancestors who had faced similar challenges with courage and wisdom. The Cherokee symbol on his door had done more than identify his heritage. It had served as a declaration of strength that had helped turn the tide of the confrontation. The 7 stars arranged in a circle had reminded him of who he was and where he came from, giving him the courage to stand firm when everything seemed hopeless. As the first police vehicles turned into his driveway, their emergency lights painting the night in flashes of red and blue, Samuel knew that this chapter was ending. But he also knew that the story would continue, that the legacy of strength and determination would be passed on to his son and future generations, just as it had been passed down to him. Deputy Maria Martinez was the first officer to arrive, her patrol car sliding to a stop in front of Samuel's house as she rapidly assessed the situation. Samuel called out his location and status, keeping his rifle visible, but pointed safely away from the approaching law enforcement. The 2 captured gang members remained motionless on the ground, clearly relieved that the confrontation was over. "Mr. Redfeather, are you injured?" Deputy Martinez called out as she approached with her weapon drawn, but lowered. "I'm fine, Deputy. I have 2 suspects here who surrendered without further incident. The rest of the gang fled south on the county road about 5 minutes ago." Deputy Martinez quickly secured the 2 captured men, while Samuel provided a detailed account of the night's events. Danny Martinez, no relation to the deputy despite sharing a surname, cooperated fully, providing information about the gang's recent activities and their plans for targeting isolated ranchers throughout the region. As additional units arrived, the property became a hive of law enforcement activity. Crime scene investigators documented the cut fences, the tire tracks from the surveillance operation, and the weapons that had been dropped by the fleeing gang members. Detective Jim White Eagle from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation arrived within an hour, his Cherokee heritage immediately evident to Samuel. "Brother," Detective White Eagle said quietly as he shook Samuel's hand, using the traditional greeting between Cherokee men. "I heard about what happened here tonight. The whole department is talking about how one man held off 6 armed intruders." Samuel shrugged, uncomfortable with praise for simply defending his own property. "My grandfather always said that the spirits watch over those who protect what's sacred. This land has been in my family for 4 generations. I wasn't about to let some gang of thugs destroy what my ancestors built." Detective White Eagle nodded with understanding. As a Cherokee law enforcement officer, he had seen too many cases where native families lost property to criminals who assumed they would be easy targets. Samuel's successful defense was more than just one man protecting his ranch. It was a symbol of resistance against the kind of exploitation that had plagued their people for generations. "Jake Barton's gang has been terrorizing ranchers from Texas to Kansas," the detective explained. "We've been trying to catch them for months, but they always manage to stay one step ahead of us. Tonight, you've given us our first real break in the case." The young gang member, Danny Martinez, had indeed provided valuable intelligence during his interview. Facing serious charges and the prospect of abandoning his children to the foster care system, he had agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His information led to the arrest of 3 more gang members within 48 hours and provided crucial evidence for prosecuting Jake Barton when he was eventually captured. As dawn broke over the ranch, Samuel found himself standing on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the last of the law enforcement vehicles disappear down his driveway. Chief had been released from the house and was eagerly investigating all the new scents left by the night's visitors. The Cherokee symbol on his door seemed to glow in the morning sunlight, a testament to the strength that had carried him through the darkest hours. Tom Harrison arrived mid-morning, bringing breakfast from his wife and staying to help Samuel repair the damaged fence. Other neighbors began arriving throughout the day, ranchers and their families who had heard about the confrontation and wanted to show their support. Samuel, who had lived a relatively solitary life since Maria's death, found himself surrounded by a community he hadn't fully realized existed. "You've become something of a legend," Tom told him as they stretched new wire between fence posts. "Word is spreading about the Cherokee rancher who single-handedly defeated the Barton gang. Folks are saying it's like something out of the old westerns." Samuel winced at the characterization. He had no interest in becoming a folk hero or having his story romanticized. What had happened was simply a man defending his home, drawing on the strength and wisdom passed down through generations of Cherokee survivors. But he began to understand that the story had taken on a life of its own. For the Cherokee community, it represented something powerful, proof that the old ways still had meaning, that the courage of their ancestors still flowed in the veins of their descendants. For the ranching community, it was evidence that they didn't have to be victims, that with preparation and determination, even isolated families could defend themselves against organized criminals. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Samuel's son David made the drive from the reservation for his first visit in several months. He found his father working in the barn, maintaining equipment with the same methodical care he had always shown. "Dad," David said, embracing the older man, "I heard what happened. Are you really okay?" Samuel looked at his son, a man in his 30s with a family of his own, successful in his career as a teacher, but still carrying the worry that children feel for their parents. "I'm fine, son. Better than fine, actually. I've been reminded of some things I had forgotten." They sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of gold and crimson. David listened as his father recounted the details of the confrontation, but more importantly, he heard the deeper story about heritage, about responsibility, and about the importance of standing firm when everything you love is threatened. "Your great-great-grandfather survived the Trail of Tears," Samuel told his son. "Your great-grandfather built this ranch from nothing, fighting discrimination and poverty every step of the way. Your grandfather defended this land during the Depression when desperate men tried to take it from him. Each generation faced their own test, their own moment when they had to choose between giving up and fighting for what mattered most." David nodded, understanding that his father wasn't just recounting family history, but passing down a legacy. "And now you've faced your test." "We all face tests," Samuel replied. "The question is whether we remember who we are and where we come from when the moment arrives." The Cherokee symbol on that door isn't just decoration. It's a reminder of what we're capable of when we draw on the strength of our ancestors. As the months passed, Samuel found that his life had changed in subtle but important ways. The isolation that had sometimes felt oppressive was now a source of strength. He had proven to himself and others that he was capable of handling whatever challenges came his way. The ranch that had sometimes felt like a burden was now clearly what it had always been, a sacred trust, a piece of Cherokee legacy that had to be protected and passed on. Jake Barton was eventually captured in Missouri, where he had been attempting to reorganize his criminal operation. The evidence provided by Danny Martinez and the other cooperating gang members ensured that Barton would spend the rest of his life in prison. The threat that had seemed so overwhelming on that dark night was revealed to have been an illusion. Dangerous men, certainly, but not the unstoppable force they had pretended to be. Samuel received a letter from Danny Martinez 6 months later, written from the state penitentiary, where he was serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. The young man wrote about using his time in prison to earn his GED and learn skills that would help him support his children when he was released. He thanked Samuel for treating him with dignity during the confrontation and for not taking the shot that could have ended his life. "I don't know why you didn't shoot me that night," Danny wrote. "I had a gun and I was threatening your property. But I'm grateful every day that you chose mercy over vengeance. My kids will have their father back because you remembered that I was a human being, not just a criminal. I hope someday I can live up to the example you showed me." Samuel read the letter several times, thinking about the choices that defined a person's character. His grandfather had always taught him that true strength was knowing when not to use violence, that the greatest warriors were those who could show mercy when they held absolute power over their enemies. On the first anniversary of the confrontation, Samuel stood on his porch at sunset, watching his cattle graze in the pasture where armed men had once crept through the darkness. Chief, now grayer but still alert, sat beside him as they surveyed the peaceful scene. The Cherokee symbol on the door behind them caught the last rays of sunlight, just as it had on that night, when everything had hung in the balance. Samuel thought about the generations of Cherokee who had stood on this same land, facing their own challenges and drawing strength from the same source that had sustained him. His great-great-grandfather had survived forced removal from his ancestral home. His great-grandfather had endured discrimination and poverty to build something lasting. His grandfather had defended this ranch against those who would take it by force. Now Samuel had added his own chapter to that story, proving that the courage and wisdom of his ancestors still lived in their descendants. The Cherokee symbol on his door would continue to stand as a reminder of who they were and what they were capable of when they remembered their heritage and drew strength from the spirits of those who had come before. As night fell over the Oklahoma plains, Samuel felt the presence of his ancestors around him, not as ghosts from the past, but as living examples of how to face adversity with courage, wisdom, and integrity. The ranch was secure, the family legacy was intact, and the Cherokee tradition of standing firm against those who would threaten what is sacred continued into another generation. The 7 stars carved into his door seemed to shine with their own light, a beacon of hope and strength that would guide his family through whatever challenges the future might bring. Samuel Redfeather had faced his test and emerged victorious, not through violence or vengeance, but through the timeless Cherokee virtues of courage, wisdom, and respect for all living things. The land was at peace, and Samuel was home.